This is part 2 commentary on the book titled The Invention of the White Race, Volume 1 by Theodore Allen. And so the question is, what was common about the oppression of the Irish, the Negro, and the Indian? Well, one thing for sure is that we know that it was done by the same group. Which group? We're talking about the English, right? And the other is that it was done in the form of racial oppression. And when we're talking about racial oppression, that word racial is being used to describe either real or imagined physical differences or other types of differences, right, that are non-physical. Now, Allen starts out the first chapter showing how the racial categories based on phenotypic or physical traits have always been a product of a human invention. Right. And so it has changed over time, as we're getting ready to see right now. So what I want you to do is pay very close attention right now to what is about to be explained. Right. And so let's open up the book right now and go to it and see if we can get some understanding.
In colonial Hispanic America, it was possible for a person, regardless of phenotype, physical appearance, to become white by purchasing a royal certificate of whiteness. With less formality but equal success, one may move from one racial category to another in today's Brazil, where it is said money whitens.
So I want you to think real hard about this right now. If in colonial Hispanic America, a person of any skin color could become white by purchasing a royal certificate of whiteness, and if in Brazil, a person could move up into the category of white just by making more money, then what does that tell us about this concept of race? One is that this race concept is based on statuses, right? It's not an actual skin color of people because obviously none of these people have a white skin color, right? And two, it's humans just like you and I, but from the ruling class who are behind the scenes creating these categories and then forcing them down the throats of people, right? And in other cases, they're simply just deceiving people into accepting these race-based realities. And we have to understand that the benefits are primarily for the ruling class people, right? That's why they put them together.
On the other hand, in the United States, the organizing principle of society is that no such whitening be recognized, whether whitening by genetic variation or by simple wealth.
The United States said they're not handing out any of these certificates of whiteness like they did in the colonial Hispanic America. And money can't buy membership into this club of being white, right? And so in other words, if you're playing the race game in America and you're viewing yourself as a race and you're not in the elite white group, then you lose by default. It's like gambling in Vegas. The odds are rigged in the house's favor, right? And the more that you play, the more you lose, right? Even if you get a small few wins here and there, in the grand scheme of things, you lose, right? And that's why I don't gamble, and that's why I don't like playing games where I'm set up to lose, right? And that's the reason why I don't play the race game, because I know it's a losing game.
In 1890, a Portuguese immigrant settling in Guyana, British Guyana, would learn that she was not white, but a sibling of that same person arriving in the United States in that same year would learn that by sea change, she had become white.
Again, what is this telling us if a Portuguese person in 1890 is not considered white in British Guyana, but the sibling of that same person in the United States of America was considered white? All the sibling did was cross the sea, and what happened? Her status changed, right? And who's making up these rules? The ruling class that's in charge of creating the census and classifying people in the business that they run called the United States of America, right? They are the people that's creating and defining these race categories, and people are just accepting it and then going along with their lives, right? You have to think about that.
In the last Spanish census of Cuba, Mexican Indians and Chinese were classified as white. But in 1907, the first United States census there classified these groups as colored.
Now, how did the Mexicans and the Chinese go from being white in the Spanish census in Cuba to being classified as colored in the 1907 census in the United States of America? And what is this showing us, right? It's showing us that none of these categories are fixed, right? And they're all subject to change. And that's depending on how the government decides to change them, right? And so one thing people have to do is they have to stop letting the government define them, right? And putting them in boxes that the government decides to create.
According to Virginia law in 1860, a person with but 3 white grandparents was a Negro. In 1907, having no more than 15 out of 16 white great-grandparents entitled one to the same classification. In 1910, the limit was asymptotic. Every person in whom there is ascertainable any Negro blood was to be deemed a colored person.
Now, look how they keep changing what qualifies someone to be classified as a Negro, right? They did this 3 times from 1860 to 1910, which should be clear enough to anybody that's listening to show how these racial categories did not just pop out of thin air, right? And people weren't just born with these things, right? There are people who are plotting on who's going to play what part in the game that they have created, which involves real people, right? And so the point is to stop playing the game, right? But there's still more. So let's go ahead and keep going.
As of 1983, the National Center for Health Statistics was effectively following the 1910 Virginia principle by classifying any person as black if either of the parents was black. At the same time, in Texas, the race classification was determined by the race of the father. Prior to 1970, a set of Louisiana court decisions dating back to the late 1700s had upheld the legal concept that any traceable amount of African ancestry defined a Negro. In 1970, racial classification became the subject of hard bargaining in the Louisiana state legislature. The conservatives held out for 1/64th, but the more enlightened opposition forced a compromise at 1/32nd as the requisite portion of Negro forebears, a principle that was upheld by the state's Supreme Court in 1974.
And so this is just a snippet on how race has been changed and redefined over the years. And so moving forward in the book, let's go into the Irish parallels of racial oppression with those of the Negroes and the Indians, right? And understand that in this sense, racial oppression is not based upon physical differences as it was with the Negroes and the Indians, because both the Irish and the English were phenotypically similar, right? But the objectives were the same, right? And the objectives were to socially destroy the entire group, right? And keep them at the bottom in what Theodore Allen calls the hallmark of racial oppression.
The assault upon the tribal affinities, customs, laws, and institutions of the Africans, the American Indians, and the Irish by English, British, and Anglo-American colonialism reduced all members of the oppressed group to one undifferentiated social status, a status beneath that of any member of any social class within the colonizing population. This is the hallmark of racial oppression in its colonial origins, and as it has persisted in subsequent historical context.
And so the idea is to oppress the entire group, right? And to keep them in a social status that's lower than any of the members of the oppressing group, right? And what this means is that the highest status of an Irishman, a Negro, or an Indian would still be ranked lower than the lowest ranking Englishman, right? And they did this by waging war on the people's customs, their culture, and their institution, because they need to stop these people from thinking and acting in their own particular way so they can implant those colonizer ideas into the people's minds, and then eventually those people would accept their place below the status of the colonizers, right? And so let's head over right now to Europe to find out some of the thoughts and the views that the English had about the Irish.
Another early English conquistador was Robert Dudley, 1532 to 88, 1st Earl of Leicester. The Irish were a barbarous people, said Leicester, and the English should deal with them as other Christian colonizers did with barbarians elsewhere in the world. This theme, repeated with variations, supplied a continuing rationale for English oppression of the Irish. At the time of the plantation of Ulster, launched in 1609, the English appealed to Christian fellowship in urging the Spanish government not to give aid and comfort to the Irish resistance. Addressing the Spanish lords of council in Madrid, the English ambassador, Sir Charles Cornwallis, asserted that the Irish were so savage a people that they long ago deserved the same treatment used by the kings of Spain in the Indies, or those employed with the Moors, scattering them in other parts. Nearly 2 centuries later, Dublin-born Edmund Burke, then the preeminent British statesman, observed that the English Protestant ascendancy regarded the Irish as enemies to God and man, and indeed as a race of savages who were a disgrace to human nature. Karl Marx applied the analogy in pursuit of the unity of working people of all countries. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker, and in relation to the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation. His attitude is much the same as that of the poor whites to the The most depraved derivation of the analogy was voiced by the English historian Edward A. Freeman, 1823 to 92, during a visit to America in 1881. The United States, he said, would be a grand land if every Irishman would kill a Negro and be hanged for it.
So we can see that the English had very strong feelings about the Irish, right? And these English attitudes towards the Irish goes back for many, many centuries. And so the English refused to recognize the Irish tribal laws, and they also denied the Irish to have rights underneath the English law, right? And so the Irish obviously had a problem with this, and they voiced their opinion and their anger in these words.
In 1317, Irish chieftains, led by Donald O'Neill, King of Tyrone, joined in a remonstrance to John XXII, Pope to both English and Irish. In that manifesto, the Irish charged that the kings of England and the Anglo-Norman Middle Nation had practiced genocide against the Irish, enacting for the extermination of our race most pernicious laws. The manifesto presented a 4-count indictment. 1. Any Englishman could bring an Irishman into court on complaint or charge, but every Irishman, except prelates, is refused all recourse to the law by the very fact of being Irish. 2. When some Englishman kills an Irishman, no punishment or correction is inflicted. 3. Irish widows of English men were denied their proper portion of inheritance. And 4. Irishmen were denied the right to bequeath property.
Now look at how the English are using the tool of law to debase the Irish. And then I want you to think about the parallels with what happened in the American colonies, right? I want you to think about the message behind the law stating that the Englishmen could bring the Irishmen to court, but the Irishmen couldn't do the same thing, right? They couldn't bring the Englishmen to court, right? And think about how the English were permitted to kill the Irishmen without having any type of punishment. And obviously we know that it wouldn't have been the same thing if the roles were reversed, right? And so think about these parallels, right? And so these are power moves in the direction of debasing people in what Allen is referring to as the hallmark of racial oppression, right? And so let's go into the book where it shows more parallels between the Irish predicament and those in North America.
Given the common constitutional principles of the 3 cases, the Irish, the American Indian, and the African American, the abundant parallels they present are more than suggestive. They constitute a compelling argument for the sociogenic theory of racial oppression. If from the beginning of the 18th century in Anglo-America the term Negro meant slave, except when explicitly modified by the word free, so under English law the term Hibernicus, Latin for Irishman, was the legal term for unfree.
You see that? Just as the English made the slave synonymous with the Negro in the 18th century, so they did the same thing with the Irish as naming him Hibernicus, which was to mean an unfree person. Think about that.
If African Americans were obliged to guard closely any document they might have attesting their freedom, so in Ireland, at the beginning of the 14th century, letters patent attesting to a person's Englishness were cherished by those who might fall under suspicion of trying to pass. If under Anglo-American slavery the rape of a female slave was not a crime, but a mere trespass on the master's property, so in 1278, 2 Anglo-Normans brought into court and charged with raping Margaret O'Rourke were found not guilty because that said Margaret is an Irish woman. If a law enacted in Virginia in 1723 provided that manslaughter of a slave is not punishable, so, under Anglo-Norman law, it sufficed for acquittal to show that the victim in a killing was Irish. Anglo-Norman priests granted absolution on the grounds that it was no more sin to kill an Irishman than a dog or any other brute. If the Georgia Supreme Court ruled in 1851 that the killing of a Negro was not a felony, but upheld an award of damages to the owner of an African-American bond laborer murdered by another white man, so an English court freed Robert Walsh, an Anglo-Norman charged with killing John McGilmore because the victim was a mere Irishman and not of free blood. it being stipulated that when the master of the said John shall ask damages for the slaying, he, Walsh, will be ready to answer him as the law may require. If in 1884 the United States Supreme Court, citing much precedent authority, including the Dred Scott decision, declared that Indians were legally like immigrants, and therefore not citizens except by process of individual naturalization, so, for more than 4 centuries until 1613, the Irish were regarded by English law as foreigners in their own land. If the testimony of even free African Americans was inadmissible, so in Anglo-Norman Ireland, native Irish of the free classes were deprived of legal defense against English abuse because they were not admitted to English law and hence had no rights that an Englishman was bound to respect.
This is the hidden history of the Irish and the English, right? That most of us have probably never heard about. And we surely hadn't heard about it in the grades K through 12, right? But these two groups were mortal enemies, right? And the English had been trying to subdue the Irish for the longest time, right? And as we have seen, the English viewed the Irish in a very similar light as they viewed the Native Americans and the Negroes, right? And due to the English having centuries-long conflict with the Irish, the English had gained much experience with dealing with tribal people, right? As the Irish were tribal people at this time. And they were able to take that experience and use it with the dealings of other tribal peoples that they had encountered, right? And understand that just because the ruling class left Europe and then they came to America and changed their identity and became white, it doesn't mean that they and their descendants totally cut themselves off from that rich history that they left in England. Right. And so they did just like Theodore Allen did. Right. And they were able to look back into the English records and find out how their predecessors did things. Right. And then they were able to use that information as a source of reference on how to deal with these newly encountered people. Right. And so this is the end of part 2 commentary on the book here, The Invention of the White Race, Volume 1 by Theodore Allen. And so stay tuned for part 2 because we're going to be talking about how the English set up that middleman or that middle buffer zone as a social control in Ireland, right? And so I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 3 in this series.